So welcome back, Damion. Good to see you in Uncommon Sense. Haven't had you here for a while. How have you been?
Thank you very much. I've been very well. Thank you for having me back.
And today we're going to talk about implement, standardize, and review. So all those things that happen towards the end of a change or an improvement.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's a part of people's projects when I'm reviewing them that I often see a number of weaknesses. So I thought it'd be an interesting area to focus on and talk about in a little bit more depth.
Yes, I know what you mean. And I think there's always that sense, isn't there? Naturally, we're at the end of a project, let's wrap it up, but actually paying some attention at the end can make a big difference, can't it?
Yeah, I think, and I suppose I could empathize with, people having done a project, right? Because I suppose when you've reached that really exciting point, or if you find that exciting point where you've finally got a solution that seems to work, you've tested it, you've got the data, you've got that sort of ever-growing confidence, you can imagine that at that point, it kind of feels like that's it, it's job done, just
Mm.
get it implemented and that's it, we can all go and celebrate. But so I think that yeah, maybe that's the psychology that perhaps causes a bit of a shortcut through the latter sort of quarter of the improvement cycle, or the improve control phase, if you're more familiar with DMAIC.
Mm. So tell us, what should people be looking at in this phase to get a really graceful and successful ending to a project?
Well, I suppose one way to frame what's really happening at that point, a simplistic way of it's probably how I think about it, is you're preparing the project for quite a major transition, which is it's moving from something that's been looked after via a project team with yourselves as project leaders to the point where you're trying to let go of it. You're trying to hand this thing over back to the business. So it's that transitional phase between, a process that you've maybe now created or modified with these, peripheral solutions, whatever they are, and you're trying to step from that being a bench test example of something that works into I'm now handing this over to the people that are going to look after it and manage it forever,
Mm.
without me being around, hopefully, without me being involved, because hopefully I'm going to be jumping off into my next project, which could take me into a completely different part of the business, perhaps. So I don't want these apron strings to still be fastened to me and the phone ringing every 5 minutes with people asking me what to do next.
Mm.
So that's, I think, the payoff of just taking the time to make this transitional piece more successful and ultimately more sustained. So I thought we could dive
And
into a
even
few of
if you
those.
work in the process, potentially, I guess the risk is you become the go-to font of all knowledge. Everyone comes to you if you don't embed
Yeah,
it correctly. Yeah.
you suddenly become, without voting for it, the subject matter expert of that
Yes.
process, and that's it. So yeah, and I'm sure for most people they've got enough on the plate to not want that. So yeah, I think careful consideration of some of the steps is really important.
Okay.
Um, so I mean, so some examples of what I commonly see, in terms of how a change is deployed, is that people have just compiled an email and maybe put some literature together. Here's the new process, here's a new policy we've written or a guide, and it's just sent out on an email. And that that's kind of like rub the hands. That's it, job done. That's implementation sorted. And I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that some of the downsides of that approach that could occur. Um, so there's a lot of tools and techniques we cover in the Greenbelt training that's designed to help us through this critical phase. And a lot of them are focused on the softer side of change. So we're really talking about the change management skill sets, the fact that change is really always involving people and how people think and feel. So you could have the greatest solution ever, technically that works brilliant, but if you don't bring the people along with you in that,
Mm.
then there's a very high risk that it's going to cause some level of upset or frustration, and ultimately worse, it just doesn't, it's not sustained. And
Mm.
there's probably nothing more depressing for a project team to have spent all those weeks and months of getting to this great point where they've found a solution, only for them to think they've made a difference, and then several weeks later, when they look back, everything's regressed back to maybe how it was before, and the problems come back. So we want to avoid that as much as we can. So careful planning is certainly one of the aspects. We recommend that people have an implementation plan.
Hmm.
And what I see all too often is people insert in that section of evidence, they put a copy of their Greenbelt project plan, which would describe how long it's going to take them to go through the various phases of our improvement cycle, or again, the DMAIC phases if you prefer those. I mean, that's an important plan, so we certainly recommend having one of those. But of course, on that plan, implementation might just be a single bar, implement
Mm.
the change, or it might just have a few subheadings. What we're really looking for there when our cycle prompts you to say, have an implementation plan, is to describe how exactly that change is going to be enacted. So imagine it like we were organising a company barbecue in a few weeks' time. So not that the
Oh, let's
weather's really
hope.
going to support us for that, maybe. Um, think of all the things we'd need to try and organise for that to be a success, right? Who's sending out the invites? Who's bringing the various different food items and the drinks? Where's it going to be? How are we going to arrange all the travel? There's all these things that need to be looked after, much the same as a real implementation of a change into a real business. There's going to be an awful lot of things that need looking after, and a good implementation plan should be identifying what those things are down at that level of detail, and also more importantly, who's going to own them, who's
Mm.
taking the action away. And of course, it's unlikely in a Greenbelt project that the project leader could do all of that stuff themselves. It's probably unlikely that even their small team could look after all of that. You're now going to be dependent on pulling on other people.
Mm.
So before you can start doing that and implementing that plan, you're going to have to start thinking about how engaged the broader audience is in the business of who's going to be required to support this. So another tool we talk about is like stakeholder analysis. So thinking about who are all the people who are likely to be affected by this change. And then you can spend a bit of time thinking about, like such as how supportive are they likely to be? Are they likely to be more resistive? What implications does that have in terms of how we approach certain parts of the implementation plan? We can't just say, right, here's your new process, go along, if they're likely to resist, okay,
Mm.
because they're going to push back and reject. Um, we talk about having a communications plan, a separate plan to the implementation plan. So this one's just looking at what are the key messages that we need to send out and who do they need to reach? And again, who's going to do that? Who's going to be responsible for that? Who's going to be accountable for it? And I always say, when it comes to change, you can never communicate enough. There'll always be somebody somewhere that is surprised by what's happening, or didn't the other comms we've made haven't reached them in whatever format they were in. So you can't really do enough of it. And again, all of that is designed to try and avoid these unplanned reactions from different parts of the business to what we're doing, and also maybe be prepared for that because
Mm.
that's also perhaps a natural part of change. Um, we also talk crucially again as part of the implementation plan about preparing people's competence. So what we mean by that is their skills and knowledge required to be capable of running this new process. If you've just brought, let's say, an IT solution into an area of the business that historically hasn't used IT, those people might be what we sometimes could call IT illiterate. They're just not comfortable using even basic IT systems. So we can't just say we've given them an IT system and that's it. We might need to spend some time showing them how to do that, letting them feel comfortable with that, and allaying all of these potential anxieties and fears and so on. And I've seen many projects that has been their big downfall. They've come up with a great solution, they've had a pretty good implementation plan, but they haven't seemed to acknowledge that people are going to need time to get used to this change. And the more significant the change, then the more important this is. So
There's
so
something
yeah,
about
there's just
frequency as well, isn't there? How often those individuals perform and run that process. Because,
right.
again, if you've done your implementation plan and you've communicated it really well and you trained the people, fantastic. But what's the legacy for me who doesn't need to do that except for every 3 months? And I can't remember and so on and so forth. There are many. It's about understanding how those users are using the process and how frequently they're using it, and it is a key part of this, isn't it, in order to sustain the gains.
Absolutely, yeah. And the second phase after implementation for us is standardize, which is exactly what you're talking about there. How do we capture and document the process so that people can follow it again in the future, especially if it's an infrequent process? You know, what if you've just improved the month-end closing of the end of year closing of the books in finance?
Yes,
That's not going to
yes,
happen for another year.
yes.
So yeah, how do we sort of get the new process down, at least documented on paper, so people can follow it? And of course, the great thing about doing that is that gives that new manager, that gives that manager of that department their at least, let's call it, their first initial level of standardization, assuming they didn't have it beforehand. And for them, that's going to be crucial for what we would expect them to do after we've walked away and implemented, because we don't want improvement to stop.
Mm,
We would want those people and the operators to be constantly looking at that process and finding small incremental improvements to it. They're going to take that standard we've created in this project, and hopefully they're going to make it even better as time goes on. So giving them that as a bit of collateral at the end of our work is a great way to hand over to another part of the business.
and what about establishing some of those, routines like huddles and, um, measurements for a process that's been improved? And is that do you see that as the project leader, or do you see that as the manager who's inheriting the new process?
I think that largely depends on what they've got already, but it is quite common that they haven't got that. That might very well be one of the recommendations that the team makes as part of implementing the new process, that they're giving them the tools to essentially manage it better in the future, not just whatever solution they've brought in. And clearly, that's quite an undertaking, right? You're now asking people to change not just the people who operate the process who've got to adapt, but you might be also recommending that the way in which that process is managed could also benefit from some level of change.
Mm.
And again, I think so long as you've got that in your crosshairs and you've planned for that and you've done all those, used some of those other tools I've mentioned, that could very well be part of your implementation.
Mm.
Yeah.
And we've talked before about review, but it is again often the poor relation, isn't it? That at the end of it, again, we're all pleased to be marching on and running off to the next shiny opportunity, and the lack of documentation for review of lessons learned and what went well and what should be changed next time is a really key part of that continuous improvement cycle going forward, isn't it?
It is. So yeah, review for those that aren't familiar with our cycle is the very last phase. So part of control within DMAIC, and it's we often say it's a chance to stop off and reflect on lessons learned, which is absolutely is. But I think a lot of people, project leaders, tend to think of themselves as what have I learned, which is important and great to capture. But I think it's much richer than that. I think I always advise the people I train that no matter how far you get through a project, if you have to abandon it at any point for whatever reason, always default to that review phase and just capture what have we learned anyway, even if we didn't get to finding a solution or we didn't even make it that far. Because there's an awful lot of learning that can come out of this approach, and not just for the project leader. So, the sponsor of the project can reflect on, well, how well did they perform? Did they do what we would expect of a sponsor? Did we choose even the right project from the very get-go? When we look at the first version of the charter we write, there's often jaws on the floor by the time we get to the end. So,
Yeah.
crikey, is that really how we thought that this problem looked? Or did we really think that solution, that goal was going to be achievable? But there's all sorts of other lessons like how have we been using data? Maybe we realise for the project we haven't been using data in the right way, or we haven't had the right measures, or maybe management might begin to reflect on that they're maybe biased towards pushing towards a solution rather than what this approach advocates is this idea of going to investigate a problem that's kind of unknown, before we way before we get to solutions. Um, are we truly customer focused in our processes, or are we really pushing more internally focused efficiency metrics everywhere, or simply pushing for cost reduction, which might drive us to act in a certain way? So if you really reflect well at the end of these projects, not only can the business capitalize on that from having good lessons learned that they can then carry on into the next projects, especially if you're a large business that's got a program of improvement, your program can get better because of the lessons learned. But also, in the grandest scale, you might even begin to reflect on slight cultural changes in the organization about the way that we think about improvement, the way that we think about data and metrics and lessons learned. And all of that can come from this simple phase of just sitting down and reflecting on what have we all learned, if we're really honest, as a consequence of going through this different, well, what might be for us a different approach to how we'd normally tackle improvement. So yeah, really important step.
Thank you very much, Damon. Great advice there. Really, really good. Thank you very much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.